Hello everyone, thank you for coming this early after all those parties. So today we're going to talk about regulation and more specifically law enforcement. So there have been other talks about more what are the rules that are coming, like MIKA and all those new regulation. What I wanted to focus on is how law enforcement agencies are actually acting at the moment and what are their strategies based on prior cases, so what has happened over the last years, but also have a look of what's potentially coming in terms of new arrangements. So first, a few words about myself. My name is Xavier Lavayssière. I'm a lecturer in Paris 1 University, which is nearby, in a master about finance, technology, and data. I'm also a member of a chair where we do research on blockchain and cryptocurrencies, and currently a lot on DeFi. And I've co-founded a few projects. ECAN is a training company, and legalico.io is a list of decisions. So it was mostly focused on ICO, hence the name. So if one of you has a better name to adapt to the new state of affairs, I'd be happy to hear that. And LibreCoder, which is a non-profit about tech education. So in prior episodes, by reviewing this talk, I realized that there is some sort of narrative in the different talks I've given over the past years. And the general idea is that my vision is that there will be a bridge between what's happening in the cryptocurrency sphere and the rest of the financial system, either directly by interacting between existing financial institutions and, on the other side, what's happening in the crypto sphere, or also more directly on the financial needs. What are the needs of individuals and small companies, and how cryptocurrencies might answer those needs. I feel this bridge is not done yet, but we are in this progress. Of course, there are many challenges, and currently we are still in a situation which is in construction. There are technical limitations. There are the difficulties of interfacing with existing systems. There are adapted identity methods that are lacking at the moment, so it's difficult to identify a user, and that's particularly missing when we look at regulation. The security, the market demand, a lot of fraud, and of course, environmental issues. So today we will focus only on law enforcement and how law enforcement is currently tackling with cryptocurrencies. One particularity of law enforcement, and which is quite surprising for this ecosystem that's always prospective and building toward the future, is that law enforcement only can work with existing laws. So as the ecosystem has grown over the past 10 years and laws have been slow to be adopted, they had to adapt and use existing laws to tackle what they seemed as problem in the crypto ecosystem. The other part is law enforcement. The purpose is not just to apply all laws for the sake of it, is to apply all laws for building a future that seems desirable. So that's guides some of the decisions that have been made in terms of enforcement. So what are the objectives of financial regulations? So one first big objective is to guarantee the integrity of the financial system. So the operational risk of one particular company, but also the systemic risks that could emerge from the world ecosystem. And as the ecosystem is growing, particularly at the moment, stablecoins are in the scope of interest of regulators, the more systemic risks are likely to occur. Really important part, and probably the one we will focus the most on, is to avoid really dangerous activities, so which is money laundering, terrorist financing, and tax fraud. So I know that in the crypto ecosystem, not everybody agrees that there is a strong need for governmental action, but I think in general society that's some elements where it's not so controversial. It's laws that protect generally the functioning of society, but that still could be debated. There is also a part that's about protecting users, so privacy of users and also against fraud. So that might be more controversial. And also, finally, to promote an open and fair competition to ensure that the market functions properly. So which is on one part to allow new entrants to participate in the market, to facilitate computation, competition, and to avoid undue benefits. This is linked to fraud on the other side, which is if companies can make money by doing something that's detrimental or not useful for the ecosystem, in the end, that diverts energy and money from more useful activities. So tackling fraud is to protect users, but also to protect the market in the end. Just to give you a scope of the different law agencies that are acting, I'm looking at the US. In my example, I will look at mostly the US and Europe, as it's the part of the world I'm the most familiar with. You have to have in mind that you have really different types of law enforcement agencies that are tackling cryptocurrencies. And so there is not one big block of law enforcement. There are different entities with different objectives. The primary one is in the US is the Department of Justice, which includes specific agencies like the FBI, DEA for drugs, but also the general services of the Department of Justice. I think it's quite specific to the US to have a Department of Justice that's both law enforcement and justice. In most Europe countries, the two activities are separated. Then you have specific commissions for specific activities. So the Securities Exchange Commission, that's only regulating the securities market, and the CFTC for the commodity market. So they have been created by a specific law and are focused on one specific type of activity. Then finally, we have the Department of the Treasury, which has different departments that are relevant for cryptocurrencies. The most important probably is the IRS, so the Internal Revenue Services, the tax service. And so that's one big part of it. And then you have the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which tackles more specifically financial crimes. So what enforcement means, when we talk about enforcement, any agency or law enforcement department has different ways of interacting with a project and try to correct a trajectory. The first level are warnings. So a warning could be just a simple letter to warn a particular actor that he might need to change some activity. An order to comply, which is a stronger recommendation, or even public naming. So they could publish on their website that a particular company is not behaving the way it should. There are also disciplinary sanctions. So by disciplinary sanction in general, we mean when there is a regulatory agency that's focused on a specific ecosystem or market, they have a procedure and it has some rules to apply some sanctions. So it could be a fine, it could be a suspension or revocation of a license, or it could be even a change in management. They could force to change some of the upper management of the company. And finally, you have criminal charges, though they could be triggered by any agency, and that will apply to individuals that have behaved in a certain way. I wanted to give you also a sense of the different law enforcement agencies I mentioned before. What are the means they have? So it's just one number, but just to give you a sense of this. When we talk about law enforcement departments, so the Department of Justice in the US, for instance, you have 100,000 people working for it. In France, you have even more people than for the full US, but you know that the US is a federal state, so you have a lot of enforcement that happens also at the state level, and I'm only looking here at the federal level. Then you have the tax services, and I wanted to mention particularly this number because you have a sense that it's an important workforce within the government to be able to apply tax laws, so also around 100,000 people. And then you have the means of specific regulatory agencies. And I'm sure that if you're listening to what's happening in regulation in crypto, you have heard a lot of the SEC and all those regulatory agencies. But in the end, they are the most likely to do any law enforcement. They have really little means. And that explains why they have really careful strategies on how they communicate, how they choose their cases, because they can't go after any project, which is not the case of the IRS that can go behind a lot of people at the same time. So let's look at the past cases. What have been the main cases that have been concerning cryptocurrencies over the past years. So first, the tax services, as I mentioned, the tax services are a strong arm of the government. In France, for instance, in 2014, the tax administration started to publish instructions on how cryptocurrencies would be taxed. So the general idea was to consider that it was trading a good, and you had to declare it with your revenue, and you would tax on this revenue. Some of those instructions have been cancelled by the Supreme Administrative Court in 2018. Notably, some disposition that didn't consider that, for instance, when you're mining, so you're participating to the Bitcoin network, so you're not really trading. You didn't just bought Bitcoin to resell it. You participated in a project and you got money out of it. So it's more, it's a different kind of revenue that you got. So probably, I'm not a tax lawyer, but probably less taxed than just trading revenues. And so they had to take down this instruction. Since there have been laws that have specified how it works in France, and now we have a clear rules on taxation. But so it was the first cases. In Germany, they have the same issues, of course, with cryptocurrencies, and already you can see that tax services have a control by the justice system, and they were, so in this particular case, somebody reported revenues of 100,000 euros in 2017, and the tax administration asked a certain amount to be paid, and the person was successful at suspending the decision of the tax administration services on the basis that the rules were not really clear at the moment of calculation, and also that there hadn't been final decision in court, so they had some delays to pay these taxes. So, yeah. Then, if we look at anti-money laundering, so you remember when I was talking about avoiding illegal activities, something that's notable is that anti-money laundering is largely enforced by criminal enforcement agencies, so not by specific market agencies, but by the more general criminal enforcement agencies. The first cases that that's important in the space, you have all heard about it, it's Silk Road. So Silk Road was a website where you could buy drugs. And there was also the Liberty Reserve, that was a decentralized currency that started in 2001. And both were tackled down by the Department of Justice around 2011, 2013. They seized the Bitcoins from the Silk Road project and auctioned them. But more importantly, they charged the founder of the two projects. So the founder of Liberty Reserve was officially in Costa Rica, but he was still successfully pursued by American administrations. And the Silk Road founder was arrested and is now in Texas, I think. Anyway, he's for money laundering, computer hacking, and conspiracy to traffic narcotics, so serious charges. The Silk Road founder, you know, has been sentenced a life sentence on those activities. So we are talking about 2013, so most of us here didn't had heard about cryptocurrency at that time. The Department of Justice was already arresting and charging people on this basis. This is in Germany. There was a website that allowed you to buy subscription to get movies, so before Netflix, but an illegal website. They got money from the subscription and they converted it mostly in Bitcoin and conducted real estate operations in Berlin, one of the two founders. And they were charged by the local administration, and the Bitcoin were seized, and they were charged for money laundering again. So money laundering is a good way to arrest all those funders of projects that imply some cryptocurrency at some point. A really complete and interesting case is BTCE. BTCE, have you heard about it? No? Oh, by the way, I should ask, who here has some knowledge about regulation and cryptocurrencies. So half of it, good. And so who here knows about BTCE? Okay. So BTCE was one of the largest cryptocurrency exchange. It was notable because you could use it with really low KYC. So for a lot of cases where you had ransomware hacks and Bitcoins, you could use BTCE to withdraw the money. So it was mentioned that it might have been used for the 2015-2016 Democratic National Convention hack. So his founder was subject of a lawsuit in the US and in Russia. In Russia, he was charged for 10,000 fines. So it looks a bit more symbolic as a charge compared to what he was subject to in the US. He was arrested in Greece in 2017, and then he was extradited to France. And he has been judged, and in last December, he has been charged for money laundering for 5 years of jail. I don't know what's the state of the extradition procedure to the US, but he was acquitted of every ransomware charges. So it's a bit similar to more recent cases where the exchange is also suspected to be part of the scheme that allowed ransomware attacks to be led because the money would go through this exchange. But there was not enough there were not enough proof to charge him with that, so he avoided those charges. And at the same time, the New Zealand police seized a lot of the bitcoins and funds that were in the BTCE exchange. So that's also to tackle the general idea that Bitcoin can be seized, but in most projects, once you reach a certain scale, it's rare that an individual holds all the keys and law enforcement finds some ways. There are some cryptocurrency enforcement cases that challenges a bit our fundamental rights, and that I think are interesting. One interesting case was in Great Britain, where a company had been subject to ransomware, and so they had paid 100 Bitcoin to a particular company. They realized that some of the Bitcoins were in control of an address linked to a Bitfinex, so they wanted to get the identity of the people that were the final owner of those Bitcoins. And the High Court of Justice of England and Wales agreed that it was a property, and then they could apply the rules of having an injunction that forced Bitfinex to reveal the identity of those Bitcoins. So that was the first decision. Another one that I found more interesting even is a really light approach to law enforcement. So in 2017, you remember there was a lot of ICOs, and especially in Estonia, which is a country that's quite digitally advanced, there were a lot of ICOs operating from Estonia. And so the agency for regulating the market, so the equivalent of the SEC in Estonia, published on its website warnings to say, these companies are selling tokens, but they don't hold any license to operate as a financial intermediary, and so they shouldn't conduct this kind of activities. But it wasn't any, remember when I mentioned all the means, it wasn't any decision, it wasn't a sanction, it wasn't a fine, it wasn't anything, it was just a naming of this company and saying they have no license on this. So from the point of view of the agency, they were just warning the users that they didn't have any license. However, the enforcement agency lost in court in 2021, so at the beginning of this year. The Supreme Court ruled that they couldn't issue this warning because in doing so, they were detrimental to those companies. And as they were not doing anything specifically illegal, there was no reason for the law enforcement agency to say that they had no license. That was detrimental to the activity of the businesses. So that shows again that even if law enforcement are often feared by crypto projects, they have limited actions in terms of what they can do concerning a particular project. And the Supreme Court said that they could act only if there was a specific law that they were breaching and that would justify an alert. Another case I wanted to mention, which is not directly linked to cryptocurrency, but as Facebook is looking in the space, I think it's relevant, is on personal data. And it's a fine by the Federal Trade Commission of $5 billion to Facebook 2 years ago on the basis that they didn't comply with a prior order. So again, you remember the different means of interaction. They had issued an order to Facebook to say that they had to comply to certain rules on how they were dealing with personal data. They didn't comply, and so a few years later, they put the $5 billion fine and also a supervisory committee for the next years that should oversight Facebook for a long time. So they definitely got in a more cornered situation. This is probably not fully coincidence that Libra ADM was announced around this same period. To me, there is definitely a shift in Facebook on how they perceive their business model and how they can go forward with their current activities. And this is probably a big part of it. Something that's really important in law enforcement is, first, international cooperation. So as I mentioned in the prior cases, you have seen that often there are different law enforcement agencies from different countries that are involved in a same case, and also engagement with the private sectors. And especially as it's a new sector, law enforcement agencies need to interact, to educate themselves, to try to identify what's the worst behavior in the ecosystem and so on. One example of this international aspect is a Telegram settlement. So Telegram, you remember, issued an ICO in 2018, but it was a foreign entity for the US. They didn't engage at all with US entities, and so they were one of the big cases to be attacked by the SEC for conducting an illegal sale of security. The SEC didn't pursue all the project, but this one was a particular example of an actor that didn't interact with them and didn't try to comply at first. And so they had to give back all the assets that were collected during the ICO, plus paying a penalty that looks small compared to the ICO amount, but yeah. So probably the most important slide is, for me, this one. And the point I want to strongly make is to understand that there is an opportunity cost for any law enforcement agency. And as a particular project, you have to consider that where you are situated and how, if you are triggering likely some activities, especially if what you're doing is maybe not perfectly, not illegal, but not perfectly clearly legal at the same time, you have to be careful of what might trigger a law enforcement action. So on the right side, you have what are the limitations of the law enforcement agencies. So they have limited financial means, they don't have limited budgets, they don't have limited practical capabilities, like seizing bitcoins. It's not always easy to seize a crypto assets. They don't have an unlimited expertise, and they don't have all the legal authority. That's what we have seen in prior examples. So what they will choose on is, on the criteria on the left, is evidence. So if they have strong evidence that there is a case, they will be more likely to enforce. And so there are many cases that are never led just because there is no strong evidence of the case, even if it's likely that it was an illegal activity. The proportionality of the risks that's incurred by the ecosystem, by individuals, by the illegal activity, the impact of their law enforcement action, the likeliness of success in court. Most crypto projects at the moment have a lot of money, and they would challenge in court any decision by a law enforcement agency. And they want to just make a statement. Most of the time, they want to make a statement and clarify the rules. So if they get a ruling that's disfavorable in the end of the process, they are missing a bit their objectives. So they will choose cases that are more likely to succeed later in court. And effectiveness toward the objective, that what I was mentioning at the beginning, law enforcement agencies are focused to shape the ecosystem in a way that seems suitable for them. And so the objective is not to apply every law. Some laws are not fully enforced. The objective is to apply the laws that exist in order to shape the ecosystem in a certain way. One last case to summarize a bit all this, and probably the most breathtaking of the last month, is a Colonial ransomware attack. So you've probably all heard about it. So Colonial is a company in the south of the US that has pipelines that provide gasoline to a lot of different activities. On May 7, they were subject to ransomware attacks. So I think they were received a message saying that they had a lot of data on them and they had to pay a certain amount of Bitcoin to a specific address. So Colonial shut down a part of its activity to avoid any malfunction, by being worried that the data would be used in a nefarious way. That disturbed a lot of the activity in the south of the US. They paid the ransom, so 75 Bitcoins to a specific address. And over the next days, we have seen the funds move over different addresses until on June 7th, the FBI was able to apply for a warrant and seize some of those Bitcoins. So what's interesting, of course, is that on the Bitcoin blockchain, and it seems that the attackers didn't realize the importance of this case. We go back to the trade-off I was mentioning before. This was disturbing a lot of the US activities, so there was no way that law enforcement agency would not act. And so if they had realized that, they would probably have put more mitigation technique in place. But you can follow the funds from the payments. So there is a specific address that received the payments. Just after, you see that there is a split in two, 10 Bitcoin on one side and 63 on the other one, which is likely that one part is for the person that provides the software and the infrastructure. That's identified as dark side, from what I understood. And the other one is probably for the people that actually led the attack. And then the 63 that left moved along several addresses until they were on the specific address that the FBI claimed to have control on and was able to seize. So there is this warrant, which is pretty interesting because it details what their method, how they analyze the blockchain to identify how to move the funds. They only seized 63 Bitcoins, even if the address had more on it, because they considered that only 63 Bitcoins were from the ransomware attack. The rest, they can't know where it comes from. It's also probably from illegal activities, but as they can't specifically identify it, they don't seize it. So they only took the 63 Bitcoin. That's a more detailed scheme of what happened. So you see that there is a Coinbase transaction first that's received by the Colonial company. The Colonial company pays the ransomware, the ransom company. Then there is a split between the two addresses, as I mentioned. And then you see the funds moving to a collecting address that received a lot of different funds from different acts. And this is where, on June 7, the last one is when the FBI sees on their own address the funds, which have not moved since. And the rest has been moved. So I don't know if it's by the FBI or probably by the hacker himself realizing that they could still move some of the funds. So there is still an open question, and I have no elements on this, of how they actually acquired control over those keys. So there are several hypotheses we can make. Insider information. One of the responsible of the attack realized that they were probably subject to strong criminal charges and preferred to redeem some of the Bitcoin and avoid some of the legal threats. It could be that they got control of a server that would hold the keys, so that could be possible, or that the keys were held by an intermediary that similarly redeemed the funds to the FBI. So there is specifically no explanation in the warrant on this, and in no communication of the FBI. I think they want to keep a bit secret these elements, but we can have an idea of what are the hypotheses. So, I don't know how much time I have, but I will just give you a few elements on where we could go in the future, and then open for a few questions if we have a few minutes left. So On the future, you realize that we are in a world of DeFi, DAOs, and trying to move in a more decentralized approach of projects. So a lot of the discussion is how this decentralization avoids some of the legal threats. My opinion is that there are still a lot of elements that needs to be analyzed precisely, and it's not just because the project is decentralized that it will avoid a lot of the legal complications. There are the legal liability of funders, and as we've seen before, most of the time, at the moment, legal enforcement goes after funders and not projects, so you still have the disability. The question of governance and dispute resolution in operation, so when something goes wrong, how problems are resolved. Financial law applicable to token activities, so I think that's the part where most of the focus is. And one part that's probably the most clear is anti-money laundering rules are not going to be avoided for any crypto activities, and that's the most likely minimal requirement we can expect from any crypto project. Taxation, again, this is a strong arm of the government, and they will not lose revenues, and the question of partnerships and contracts and so on. So we don't see the emojis, it's cuter with emojis, but it's just, I looked at DeFi project and tried to identify where they were headquarters, where the founders were. So the headquarters, of course, is of one specific company. Most projects claim to be an ecosystem with no one central company, but in most projects you have one project, one company that's definitely leading most of the research and marketing operation of the project. The only one that has its emoji is SushiSwap. You know that is probably slightly less identified than others, even if that's debatable. But still, so DeFi projects have founders, have headquarters. They have users also, so a lot of the users of DeFi projects I've looked at the frequentation of their websites is in the US, in China, and some in Australia, which are countries that have a good and efficient law enforcement. Well, I will just jump to maybe the general idea I want to give is that what's open at the moment is what are the different new ways we're going to enforce rules on crypto projects. One way to do that is to have permission open models, that's what I call. So it's keeping some of the decentralization and openness that we have in the current ecosystem while having some elements of permissioning to make sure that people that interact abide by certain rules. The most obvious one system is to have a whitelisting, so it's pretty easy to do technically to have a whitelisting procedure before engaging with specific projects. We could have automated process with a legal backup or recognition. That's the subject of DAOs. So a DAO is a formidable way to organize some activities, but I think that's the discussion that's going forward is how this is intertwined with having some legal backup if something goes wrong. There are already examples of this done really interestingly. For instance, Centrifuge that has this legal backing behind some decentralized activity. And then you have all this field of technically enforced processes. So law enforcement agencies, regulators love this idea, but I think technically it's probably difficult to do, is having in the code some elements that ensure that the funds can't move without respecting some rules, for instance. So we could use zero-knowledge proof to ensure that some private transaction don't go above a certain threshold, otherwise it's reported, or we could imagine a lot of these kind of rules, or also use hardware enclaves and have this kind of enforcement. This is interesting, of course, but this is way forward in terms of how likely it is to go. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Do we have a few minutes? Okay. Yeah.
Can be also another man.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if there are any questions, they are welcome.
Morning. Thank you for your presentation. What do you think about the MiKA regulations coming out in the fall? MiKA?
Yeah. So MiKA is the big regulation that's coming in Europe. There is a talk tomorrow, I think, with Simon that should be interesting about what should be the strategy of DeFi project about this. And there was one yesterday by Victor also that might be interesting on regulation. So the general idea of MiKA is to create a lot of categories and DeFi for each category what will be the rules, have a strong enforcement on stablecoins because it was designed probably at the time of Libra, so they were scared about stablecoins. And I think that's probably the most detrimental aspect, that it's really tampering with the ability of creating stablecoins in Europe. But at the moment it's being discussed, and the European Commission is pretty good at taking into account feedbacks. So I don't know at which stage we are exactly at the moment, but I know that there is a lot of arrangement that we can expect between the initial text and what's going to be adopted in the end.
And most of the laws are written for third person, right? So somebody who's held responsible for an action.
Yeah.
Right? And with DeFi, with smart contract, who's going to be held responsible for this kind of?
That's a good point, and that's why and that's the title of this slide. I'm saying that we move from entity-based to embedded rules. Definitely, I think the future is to look a bit less at the individual responsibility of a company or an individual, but to try to have a system that's well designed and guarantees some of the property we want to have. The problem is, at the moment, if you are not an entity that's registered and is legally liable, and that's what happened in the prior cases I mentioned, it's individuals that are liable. And so I think it's the worst case scenario is that as a founder, you are personally responsible and you go to jail if something goes wrong in your project. Most of the financial system at the moment, a lot of illegal activity happens, a lot of things go wrong, and the founders don't go to jail because they are protected by the legal framework, which is also maybe discutable. But I see the future going more toward the infrastructure and trying to have a system, and I think that's a fantastic part of crypto, to offer the possibility of having a system that offers some guarantees, but that's the current state of affairs.
Thank you for this presentation. I would like to follow up on that question of, I think DAOs are sufficiently well protected themselves in a way, the individuals are not. What do you think are the best ways for DAOs to protect their contributors? What can they do today?
How DAOs should protect their contributors? The best way is to think about what's the legal filter. Safety net, I would say. So if something goes wrong in the DAOs, if there are really a nefarious activity that happened through this DAO, how individuals are shielded from what happened in the DAO. I don't think that the pseudonymity approach is really safe, and definitely so I'm looking a lot at all the initiatives that have been done, so you're probably aware of it, of having different ideas on how we can either recognize an existing DAO as a legal entity, just having some rules that would automatically recognize it, having contracts, so it's also a way to get recognized as a DAO and saying, okay, besides the code aspects, there is some contract that explain what happened, and that still can be recognized by a judge, or having a formal registered company, which is also the approach that some states and countries approach. So, yeah, that's the lawyer part in me, is to always think that things will go wrong, and it's better to have some safety net.
Just to comment on a question.
Yep.
The comment is from your initial slide of the U.S. regulatory agencies. There was no listing, there's no line for U.S. states, but it appears that U.S. states have some muscles to flex here as well.
Sure.
As evidenced by BlockFi's investigation yesterday by New Jersey, of all things. I didn't even know New Jersey had a securities regulator. My question is more to do with the EU and comments coming out of various politicians about privacy and is the idea about anonymous crypto accounts, which we all kind of have, right? And how likely do you think it is that we're going to have to disclose all of our crypto accounts or crypto addresses as part of some kind of official, like, is privacy going to die?
That's an excellent question and something I'm really interested in, how we can manage some balance. So we have already a lot of decisions that shows that when law enforcement wants to have access to all your information about you, all the accounts, in Europe, in the US, you have decisions that mitigate this. You know, there was a decision about Coinbase, I think, a few years ago, where the tax services wanted to have all the accounts that Coinbase had because they realized that there was a discrepancy between the amounts that were declared by Americans and the amounts that they could see in the market and the activity of Coinbase. But the court decided that they would only have to reveal some big accounts, but not every account of every user on Coinbase. So then there is a question of all the unhosted wallets or anonymity tokens and all these. So, and also, this is a big question currently in CBDC projects, so the project of central bank digital currency, how they will be designed and how private they will be and how private can be acceptable. My view is that currently we have already cash and we have already some part of the economy that are fully private. And I think it's probably a good thing that some of the financial activity is fully private, even if that means that some illegal activity will happen. And then the question is where we put the lines to avoid too much detrimental financial activity. And so I don't have the answer of what's going to happen in the next years. There's definitely a big area of focus. But I've met regulators and politicians and starting to have a thinking in this balance. Like a few years ago, it was clear that every privacy should be tackled. So now they have realized that cryptocurrency are actually mostly not so private. And even on CBDC projects, there are some discussion on like how transparent it should be for every actors. And yeah, I don't have the answer of what's going to be the final decision, but the idea is already there that maybe some full privacy is useful for some cases.
Yeah, I was just wondering about your thoughts on the announcement of the European Commission yesterday about the travel rule, implementing the travel rule for crypto companies in Europe, and whether you think that it could mean that at some point in the future, using self-hosted wallets for individuals would become practically impossible. So we would invest in crypto assets, maybe we would be free to do that, but then we could only send them from one crypto compliant crypto service provider to the other.
That's an excellent point. So yes, yesterday the European Commission announced 4 pieces of legislation about anti-money laundering and with a lot of new rules. What I think is going to happen, and it's already what you can see with the BTCE cases I mentioned before, is that authorities have a good idea of what's the scope of the, I would say, transparent part of the ecosystem and the opaque part of the ecosystem. And when they tackle one big crypto exchange like this, they know that they are kind of shutting a door to a fully opaque part of the ecosystem. And then most of the transactions have an entry point that they can control. And I think that's the objective. So with the European Commission rules, what's going to happen is that most of the users will buy on an exchange, then use maybe an unhosted wallet, but that still sends some information when you're doing the transaction to the counterparty. So you have some transparency from the compliance point of view. But still, I think that it will be possible that in parallel, you keep some fully private transaction. If people have mine on their side and then they use a downloaded open source unhosted wallet, I don't think that at the moment there is a thinking on how to fully eradicate that. But they want that the most common users will be tracked and followed. And yeah, so I think that's the stage we are at. And definitely the proposition is in this direction. So we are not going to shut down all cryptocurrencies, but everything that's happening with some legal entry point is going to be clear from the beginning to the end. Yeah, so it's time. Thank you very much for listening, and happy birthday.